APM, American Public Media.
Citizens Property Insurance. Whether recovering or preparing, Citizens is available. Claims can be tracked at citizensfla.com or reported by calling a live Citizens representative.
Constangy, Brooks, Smith & Profit, LLP, representing local and national employers in labor, employee relations, and workplace law matters since 1946, with offices in Jacksonville, Tampa, Miami, and Lakeland. More at constangy.com.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler, and on today's First Coast Connect, new data show domestic murders in Jacksonville at an 8-year low. We talked to the CEO of a local women's shelter and a survivor of intimate partner violence about progress made and the challenges that remain. Then our election coverage continues with Florida House candidate Keith Matthews. The Florida House District 18 Democratic contender answers your questions and tells us about his platform. And the freaks come out at night, this time for a Halloween-themed sideshow at Intuition Ale Works. We talked to the event's organizers. Plus, the Jaguars get mauled by the Chicago Bears across the pond. News4Jack sportscaster Alessandra Pombrian gives us the London lowdown. Join the conversation. Send your questions or comments to First Coast Connect, WJCT.org, or tag us on social media, or call us at 904-549-2937. It's all ahead this hour after the day's news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Windsor Johnston. Israel says 4 of its soldiers were killed and dozens of others were wounded after the Iran-backed militant group Hezbollah struck an army training base. NPR's Daniel Estrin reports it was one of the deadliest attacks on Israel in the past year.
Hezbollah in Lebanon said it had targeted the base in the central Israeli city of Binyamina in retaliation for Israeli strikes in Beirut last week that killed 22 people. Israeli Army radio reports the drone hit the roof of a dining hall full of soldiers. The military says more than 50 soldiers were wounded, 7 of them seriously. Israel is investigating why the drone was not intercepted by air defense systems. The army says Hezbollah has fired about 13,000 rockets, missiles, and drones since it began firing on Israel last year. Israel's offensive against Hezbollah in Lebanon continues. Lebanese health officials say at least 51 people were killed in Israeli strikes Sunday. Daniel Estrin, NPR News, Tel Aviv.
The presidential candidates are crisscrossing the nation in a last-minute effort to make their pitches to voters. Vice President Kamala Harris, who has picked up endorsements from some high-profile Republicans, has been appealing to non-MAGA members of the party in recent weeks. NPR's Danielle Kurtzleben reports former President Donald Trump is taking a different approach.
For his entire political career, Trump has used authoritarian language, nativistic language. He praises authoritarians. So yes, that's the baseline we're working with here. But he has been ratcheting things up in recent weeks continually.
That's NPR's Danielle Kurtzleben reporting. Both Harris and Trump will hold events in the swing state of Pennsylvania today. The candidates are expected to campaign heavily for the state's 19 electoral votes. 3 economists based in the United States have been awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics for tackling one of the oldest questions in their field. NPR's Scott Horsley reports the 3 explored why some countries are rich and others are poor.
The wealth of some nations and the poverty of others has been a preoccupation of economists since Adam Smith founded the discipline in the 1700s. This year's Nobel Prize goes to 2 economists from MIT, Darren Acemoglu and Simon Johnson, and James Robinson at the University of Chicago. The 3 were recognized for tracing the path of various European colonies, some of which formed democratic inclusive economies, and others that were more extractive and autocratic. The former tended to prosper, while the latter languished. Acemoglu says the findings are generally pro-democracy, but he cautions it's no panacea. Democracies have to deliver, he says, or they'll lose the confidence of their people. Scott Horsley, NPR News.
This is NPR News in Washington.
You're listening to WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Jacksonville's Downtown Investment Authority is considering a new type of financial incentive for developers to encourage residential growth. According to the Jacksonville Business Journal, a DIA committee will vote tomorrow on the incentives for building mixed-use developments with multi-bedroom apartments or workforce housing. The goal is to bring in 1,500 new apartments within 3 years. The program will be limited to the core of downtown between Broad, State, and Liberty Streets and the St. Johns River. Florida's struggling citrus industry was already expected to produce less fruit during this growing season, and that was before Hurricane Milton. Based on surveys conducted in mid-September, the U.S. Department of Agriculture Friday released a forecast for this season that showed a nearly 17% decrease from last year. Now growers have to deal with the aftermath of Hurricane Milton, which made landfall in Sarasota County before crossing the state.
There's a lot of fruit on the ground. What was promising to be a very hopeful season, we're pretty discouraged to see that much fruit blown off the trees, to see a massive hurricane like this come across the citrus region.
Growers say that it takes about 2 years for groves to recover from major storms, and many plantings after 2022's Hurricane Ian were just starting to take hold. It is 67 degrees in Jacksonville, up to 87 this afternoon, a sunny sky with windy conditions from the west today.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include EBSCO, committed to providing colleges and universities with relevant online research databases to ensure student, faculty, and staff success. Learn more at ebsco.com. This is NPR.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health.
Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, Jacksonville observes Domestic Violence Awareness Month with domestic murders at an 8-year low. We ask an advocate and a survivor what the numbers mean and whether they are cause for optimism. Later, we ask Florida House District 18 candidate Keith Matthews why he believes he deserves your vote. But first, it's a year that brings some rare good news in terms of domestic violence. Homicides on the First Coast at an 8-year low. To talk about the trend, changes, and remaining challenges, I'm joined by Gail Patton, CEO of Hubbard House and a domestic violence shelter here in Jacksonville. Good morning.
Good morning, Ann.
We're also joined by Heather, a survivor and a spokesperson who gave the keynote at this month's Domestic Violence Awareness event at the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. Good morning, Heather.
Good morning, Ann.
I appreciate you being here, Heather, and I know that this had to have been a difficult speech that you gave. It seemed to be really well received. How did you decide that you wanted to do that?
I've really just felt called to make sure that the awareness is out, and one of my story is just one that's out there, and others will know, like, oh, there's more than just me going through this, and if my story can help at least one person realize they're not alone, then that's what I'm going to continue to do.
Telling a story publicly is probably more difficult than just sharing it with the people that you know. How did you prepare for it, emotionally and psychologically?
A lot of prayer and a lot of time with my friends, just kind of going over and talking to them and having reassurance from my little tribe of people who are in my corner every day and encouraging me and talking to my kids and their encouragement to do this so that others can get help.
And your kids are a big part of your story. You have 2 boys?
Yes, they're 16 and 15.
Yeah. And are your great champions, but they also witnessed some of this really difficult period in your life as very young children.
Yeah, they did. My youngest thankfully doesn't remember a whole lot. Unfortunately, my oldest was old enough to remember some things that we've worked through throughout their life just so that they never had to remember a lot of that. We've talked about it. They're very aware of everything. They know my story through and through now that they're older. And their goal is, as well as mine, to make sure nobody ever has to go through what I did or no kids have to go through what they went through.
I think what's sort of, offsetting or I think just makes people really wonder when they hear about the origin of your relationship because it was sort of like this idyllic, like you were high school friends and then you reconnected and you had this, you know, you had 2 children. It started off seemingly as a very kind of positive union.
Yeah, it did, until I got pregnant a couple months later, and that's when the violence started, and I really didn't know it was abuse at the time. I really just kind of thought, "Oh, I did something wrong," because that's what I was made to believe, and I stayed in the relationship thinking this would get better if I just was good, and I didn't make him mad or didn't say anything off the walls that could upset him, and I tried to get away a couple times, and that didn't last, and it didn't work out in my favor at that time, and I eventually was able to, for my sake of my kids, finally leave.
I was listening to your presentation, and you said that the night that you were discussing, where there was this real violent attack where you ended up badly injured, that you had created a way of communicating with your neighbors. I mean, that this was something that had been ongoing, and you had a way that you would try to communicate with them through the wall. Tell us a little bit about how that came to be.
Yeah, so my neighbor and I had finally talked enough that because we were really close, but I would not tell her anything. I didn't want anyone to know. And I finally just said to her, I need out. I am scared. And if I don't get out soon, something's going to happen. And she said, okay, this is what we're going to do. If something happens, bang on the wall. We will be right over and we will get help. I said, okay. And that day I kept trying to get to the wall and I kept trying and kind of trying and there was just no getting to it. And it was scary because all I kept thinking was, well, this is it because I can't even get help. And my kids are so scared right now. And watching my kids scream and hearing it and just praying that something happens that they're safe and I can get out of this. But if it was the end, that they were safe and they wouldn't have to endure what I did.
So the night that occurred, he, your husband at the time,
He was actually not my husband. He was my boyfriend. We were engaged. I didn't let the conversation go too far about getting married. I was very kind of not weird. Well, I was weary to actually go that far. I knew something wasn't right, but I just couldn't push myself to actually get married.
and if you're okay talking about it, just tell us a little bit about what happened that night.
I could tell he was in a bad mood, and the kids were being kids, and my youngest went to go in the back room where he was. So I had called him to come sit with me and watch TV instead because I didn't want him to upset his dad. And apparently, as soon as he heard that, he came running out of the room, screaming insults, vulgar words. Um, he grabbed me by my throat and was screaming in my face, getting tighter. And at one point, all I could just keep doing was looking at my kids. I wasn't even listening anymore to what he said because I just knew. And we were in the kitchen, and I kept getting pushed back into the counters, and I could feel it on my back. And I just kept reaching, trying to get to the wall just to bang, just so they would hear. And every time I moved my hand to get closer to the wall, he'd pull us further away from the wall. And eventually I felt a very sharp pain and a pop. And I went to the ground with his hands around my neck, still getting tighter. And finally, when he let me up, I thought my knee broke or my leg. I didn't know what happened. And I just knew I needed medical help. And for over an hour, he refused to get me a phone and continued to scream and say things to the boys like, your mom deserved that. And finally, he threw the phone at me, and I was allowed to get help. But I had stood up and I relocated my knee because it had dislocated. And finally, as the ambulance was there, he was hovering, and they were asking what happened. And I changed my story enough that I was hoping somebody would pick up, because at first it was I tripped over my son. Then it was I tripped over my son's toy. Then it was I tripped over my other son or the remote. I try to keep changing the story, hoping somebody would catch on that the story was not adding up. Unfortunately, nobody did. I went to the hospital I was worried because my kids were home with him. And then I came home and I got the "I'm sorry, it'll never happen again," and the tears, and I call them crocodile tears.
Gail, it's a difficult story that Heather has. It's not unfamiliar to you in your years at Hubbard House.
No, it's not, but it also just shows the courage and the brilliance and the strength, the survivors of domestic violence, what they do to keep themselves and their kids safe. It's really amazing, Heather. You are a strong, courageous woman, and although we hear these stories all the time, and it's horrible that domestic violence exists, the honor of knowing people who have been through this and who have survived and have come forward to share is really amazing, because you get to see a level of strength, a level of resiliency that you don't see anywhere else. And so it's always been an honor for me to do this work and to know survivors and to hear their stories of bravery and courage and resiliency. And it keeps us moving forward until there's a day when there are no more victims of domestic violence left.
If you're just joining us, we are talking about Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We are talking with the CEO of Hubbard House. We're talking with Heather, who is a survivor. If you want to join the conversation, or if you have a comment or question, you can reach out at 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, or you can tag us on social media. Gail, I want to ask you, though, how important is it to have somebody that is willing to be a messenger like Heather? This is an annual event at the sheriff's office where you present the report, which looks at the previous year domestic violence statistics. And you typically do have someone that comes and, speaks and shares their own story.
It's incredibly important, because sometimes when we have reports like this, people just think of these as numbers or statistics. But when we have a live human being coming forward and sharing their story, telling about the reality of domestic violence, it makes it real, it makes it human, and it makes all of us in the community want to do something to respond to help survivors and their children.
How do you make sure that somebody is ready, prepared, and psychologically capable of presenting at an event like that so publicly?
Well, we have our director of community education, which is Stephanie Brown, and she talks with the people who are involved in our speakers bureau, and they go over their story with her. We also look at safety planning with the person. Is it safe for you to tell your story publicly? Because for some people, it still may not be safe. And so we give them that type of support, that type of encouragement, and we never ask somebody to do something they're not willing and ready and able to do.
Yeah. And Heather, I guess you felt at this point you're a little bit beyond this. In terms of time frame, it was a decade or so ago.
Yeah, it was 12 years. I got to a place where I wasn't trying to be silent anymore. I was done being silenced. I wrote a book about it. I sent Stephanie a message and said, if I can write a book, I can speak and tell my story in public. And she had messaged me and was like, I have this opportunity. And I was like, yes. Instantly, yes. I don't care what it entails. Yes. Because if I can tell my story, then others can come forward and tell their story. And we can save others, and we can hopefully eventually get the numbers down to zero.
So you were helped by Hubbard House, not necessarily as a shelter, although that is a service that they provide, but you had moved away for a time and then came back. Explain how they were able to help you relocate.
Yes, they did. When I got back here, I had nothing. I literally packed enough clothes to get us on a train and a bus and said, I'm done. Let's go. This is what we're taking. This is what we have. And I had nothing. And I looked at everyone. I looked at my friend. I was like, what do? I don't have anything. This is why I stayed for so long. I was so afraid. And she said, Hubbard House. And I was like, what is Hubbard House? She goes, it's, a domestic abuse shelter, and they have other resources. And I was like, but I wasn't abused. What are you talking about? Even though I knew I was abused. And we went there, and they helped me with furniture for my first apartment with the boys. They helped me clothe the boys and myself. And it was the greatest gift I could ever have had.
Had you, prior to this relationship, had you had other relationships that had violence in them?
No, that was my first one. And it was, logically, I knew. but I was so conditioned to believe that what was going on was not abuse and that it was my fault. I don't know how many times I could tell you I heard on a daily, "You made me do this." He would tell his friends, "Look what she made me do. She made me do this." So I started to believe it.
Gail, I guess that's not uncommon. You do hear a great deal of stories about women, particularly who are conditioned to believe that what they're experiencing is not abuse, and sometimes it's verbal, and sometimes it's emotional, um, pressure, psychological, and sometimes it escalates to violence. But it's all kind of this controlling pattern.
It is. And when we see exactly what would happen with Heather, is that abusers try to isolate the victim and they become the only voice in the victim's head, telling them they're good for nothing, they'll never amount to anything. It's your fault if you had cooked the dinner better, if you had arrived on time, if you had kept the kids silent, if you had let me play with the kids. I mean, the list goes on, and they're all excuses for the survivor. What the abuser's telling the survivor to help the survivor be more isolated and to think it's their fault. Because if it's their fault, the abuser thinks that the survivor thinks it's their fault, then they're not going to get help. They're going to try to fix it. And unfortunately, what we do know is that survivors believe that because that becomes the only voice because they aren't telling everybody what's going on. This is a crime, but this is a crime where the victim feels ashamed and responsible for the crime. And so it's just unfortunately very uncommon, very common, which is why when survivors take that step, that first step to call, ask for help, or to leave, that they are doing something incredibly brave and something that the abuser has tried actively to prevent from happening. And so that's why Hubbard House and other domestic violence centers are around to help survivors in whatever way that they need help. And it's just very important that survivors listening to this story right now understand that if they're hearing any of themselves in Heather's story, that there are people who will believe them, there are people that will get them help, and that they are not alone, that they can get away from this abusive relationship. But call for help. Call to find out a way to do it safely because it can be one of the most dangerous times when a person decides to leave an abusive relationship. So get help, do safety planning around it, but just know you're believed and you're not alone. And that's what I want survivors to know. I know that's what Heather wants survivors to know, why she's sharing such a personal part of her life with everybody so that other people understand there's help out there for them and that their life can be different. Heather is a living example of that.
Thank you.
Heather, how do you communicate your story in other ways? I know you wrote a book. You've, been in counseling with your children, and so you've had that experience. Is it something that you share widely outside of that circle?
I just started to. For the longest time, only a select few of my friends even knew. My family didn't know until my book came out. No one knew. And I knew when that came out, everyone was going to know. So I finally told my tribe, the ones that didn't know, what was going on in my past. And I've been more open. It's a testimony of my resilience and who I am and my children are. And I know now that the more I tell, the more somebody's going to hear it and the more it's going to be shared and the more somebody will hear it from somebody else and they're going to ask for help.
What is the name of your book if people are interested in it?
When Silence Speaks.
Okay. Gail, are we doing enough to focus on the front end of this problem in terms of abusers, where this, is originating, what causes people to behave in controlling and abusive manner like that? Is the society doing enough to kind of figure out what those causes are and address them?
Well, there are definitely programs out there that help abusers change their patterns and what they're doing. The problem with that is most abusers don't raise their hand and go to do that voluntarily. They have to be court ordered because they don't see it as their problem. They're not only telling the victim it's their fault and their problem, they're believing it's their fault and their problem. So you have to have a true mind shift and a mind change if you're an abuser to understand that. And they just don't typically come forward and ask for that help. That's why when a person gets an injunction for protection or otherwise known as a restraining order, the judge can and should order a person into a certified batterers intervention program. That is why we have a program called our Batterers Accountability Program, which works with the court systems to hold batterers accountable to what the judges have ordered for them. Because, there's a lot going on in the judicial system. There's a lot to keep track of. So having those positions that can help that abuser be held accountable by the system is important. It's also important, and I can't say this enough, oftentimes you'll hear abusers say, yeah, I'll go to counseling, but I'll go to family counseling, or I'll go to couples counseling. That is not indicated for abusers, and here's why. For one thing, when you go into marital counseling or couples counseling, there is a thought that this is a couple's problem. This is not a couple's problem. This is one person choosing to break the law and abuse somebody else. The total responsibility for that violence, for that abuse, rests on the shoulder of the abusers. If you go to couples counseling, it gives the impression that it is a couples issue. It is not. And then also, if the victim decides to tell the truth in couples counseling, then they're going to suffer repercussions when they get home. If they aren't telling the truth, what good is the counseling? So we really, as a society, need to understand when we hear about our friends, families, coworkers being abusive to their partners, making jokes about it, telling them, that's not acceptable. Not suggesting going to couples counseling or marital counseling, telling that person they need to get help. That's one way that we as a community can back up what our judicial system already has in play.
Heather, I know you said that you really tried to keep this a secret and not share it when it was happening, and even after it had happened, until you wrote your book. Do you feel there were missed opportunities, though, people who perhaps knew what was going on and might have done something more? And if so, what would you have encouraged them to do?
Yes, actually, there is many missed opportunities. Come to find out after they've read the book, they're like, we knew. We needed you to say something. We couldn't step in until we heard you say something. Or why didn't you tell me? And it's a hard conversation because it's embarrassing sometimes for us, because we get the question all the time, why don't you just leave? Because it's not simple as that. It's scary to leave. Sometimes we are so broken down. I know I was, that I didn't know if I could even be a mom on my own. I didn't know who I was. I was just his girlfriend and their mom. And what was I going to do without him? Because I was told I wouldn't survive without him. Nobody would want me. Nobody would help me. Nobody would believe me. And I believed that for the longest time. And even after I was finally free, who would still believe it? Because I stayed. And then I was embarrassed because I stayed. And then I felt guilty for staying. And then it wasn't until I really got into therapy and help that I realized that none of this was my fault. And I wish I would have spoken up sooner. And I was silenced for so long. And now 12 years later, I refuse to be silenced anymore.
Gail, I wonder if you have any suggestions for people who are perhaps witnessing something. I mean, we just saw over the weekend a correctional officer here in Jacksonville got shot and killed after intervening in a domestic dispute, trying to protect a woman who was being, shouted at. I think from our personal experience, we all know somebody who has tried to intervene in an incident. Very often, the victim is also reluctant to accept help for all the reasons that you've already discussed. But what advice do you have for somebody that might be wanting to intervene but doesn't want to provoke things, make things worse, or even put themselves in danger?
Well, part of the thing of intervening is not necessarily always intervening right at the time a situation is going on, but taking that survivor to the side at some point when the abuser's not around and say, hey, I could be off the mark. However, I've noticed XYZ. If you ever need help, I'm here for you. If you ever need to go on the internet and look for resources, you can come to my house to do it, because to do it at their own house could be very risky and dangerous. To do it on their own phone could be very risky and dangerous. So offering those little cues, and to know that if a survivor denies it, says, no, 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 that's not true, or even if they get mad, it's okay, because you've offered that help, because when they're ready to help, they're going to remember who had the bravery to step up and say, can I help? And know that if that survivor has denied it to you, part of that is a life-saving tactic to that survivor, because they've been told, if you tell anybody, I'll kill you, I'll kill the children, I'll kill your family. And so they're trying to protect all of us sometimes. So don't take it personally if they get upset or they deny it, or, how dare you say that to me? just say, okay, hey, just want to let you know I'm here to help whenever it's possible. And then I just want to say about this weekend, I mean, the bravery of the JSO officer, even in his off hours, wanting to help a survivor of domestic violence, a trained professional. And we do have a wonderful police force here in Jacksonville who does, as this officer showed us with his life, want to protect survivors. And so calling the police in those really intense situations is the thing to do oftentimes to remain safe.
I want to take a couple of calls. We have a call from Charles on the west side. Good morning, Charles. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Back in the 90s, unfortunately, I got drunk and I hit my wife. And during the court proceedings, I was sent to, back then they called it anger management for 13 classes. And it helped me out a lot in my daily life with how to deal with stress and anger. And needless to say, we're not married anymore, but it did last another 3 years after that. We had an amicable divorce. But I got to say that the anger management program, or whatever they call it now, it's extremely helpful for somebody like me that lost control one evening,
Thanks for sharing your story, Charles. I mean, that's important testimony, Gail, that anger management, those kinds of interventions can actually make a difference.
Well, and what we've learned over the years is that anger management is an option, but it's not right now the best option for batterers. That a batterer's intervention program, which is much longer than the 13 weeks that Charles went through, is able to get in there and not only deal with those issues related to reactivity to situations, but also change those things in our mind that the abuser believes makes it okay to abuse somebody in their family. And so, this is a great example of how behavior can change when we hold people accountable and we provide the opportunity for them to attend batterers intervention programs.
Wednesday, you have your 30th annual fundraising breakfast. It's the Barbara Ann Campbell Memorial Breakfast, actually named after the sister of former Mayor Jake Godbold, who was murdered by her husband. This is from 7:30 to 9 a.m. at the Prime Osborne. Gail Patton, thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. Heather, thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Up next, we're talking to Florida House District 18 Democratic challenger Keith Matthews. Welcome back. With longtime Republican incumbent Cindy Stevenson ousted by term limits, the race for Florida House District 18 is wide open. Joining me to talk about his bid for the seat is Democratic candidate Keith Matthews. Good morning, Keith.
Good morning.
So this is an area that is northern St. Johns County, Ponte Vedra, Fruit Cove, World Golf Village, Volano Beach. Why do you want to represent that district, and why do you think people ought to vote for you?
Well, I've been living in St. Johns County since 1996. I'm an RN, so I just wanted to bring some compassion, empathy back to politics a little bit, and this is just the district that, I'm in love with, and it's my home district. It's where I live.
You're an RN. You're actually a hospice nurse. Is that right?
Hospice, yes. I started out emergency room, critical care, and have been doing hospice since about 10 years, something like that.
That's difficult work. How has it shaped you?
Well, how's it shaped me? It's kind of hard that's a great question, actually. But I would say it just makes me more of somebody who takes other people's considerations and their heart and what they find important as more important, more or less than my own, if that kind of makes sense. I'm kind of like a servant, and I always have been, and that's kind of where my heart is, and I just want to be now a servant on this level of politics. I just don't like what's been going on. I don't like the direction that our politics has been for the last few years, and I think I can help.
Yeah. So let's talk about your platform. What are your priorities if elected?
Well, I really want to get away from culture wars and just kind of leave people alone. Kind of like be a freedom type of platform, freedom candidate, freedom of choice, freedom of to make your own decisions, just get out of my bedroom, get out of my doctor's office, get out of my world and let me be, you know what I mean? Not me personally necessarily, but me collectively. And that's where my main platforms are. don't like that we don't have Medicaid expansion in the state. I don't like that we don't have that we turn down things like food for the poor this summer because it's seen somehow as being a political issue. I just think it should be for the people, for we, serving people, not serving myself, not serving just special interest or whatever it may be.
Any legislative priorities? I know that you have answered some questionnaires talking about things like insurance rates, the environment, development.
Correct. I really am a fan of the Florida Green New Deal, if you've ever seen that, or hopefully that'll become more of a topic at some point coming up. Legislatively, expanding Medicaid. I know that's kind of been an ongoing thing in this state, but at the same time, the outgoing House of Representative Speaker was one of the biggest opponents to it. Said it's dead on arrival. Well, now he's no longer going to be there, so hopefully maybe that can actually happen in this state. It needs to happen. We need more insurance. We need to be able to insure people with the money that we're sending to the federal government. Send it back to us to help insure our people. What's better for the people? That's just it. I'm for the people, and I don't feel like our government's been doing that in this state, and that's the direction I want to go.
What about the recent storms? Are there lessons learned here in Florida that change anything about how you view insurance or the need and the will to rebuild?
Well, insurance that's really quite an issue on itself. One thing I do know is in insurance for the last 10 years, for example, or since 2020, we are actually a distant third in damage to state from storms. I think a lot of it is obviously tragic, and a lot of it is we need to prepare better as best we can. But at the same time, it's kind of overblown sometimes and from what I can see, of what's causing our insurance rates to be so high. I know Texas, for example, has more than double, the damage and from storms year round than we have, but yet they have close to half of the actual insurance premiums from an individual standpoint.
And what do you attribute that to?
I attribute it actually to paid off politicians, to be honest, to money. My opponent right now, for example, I can't even identify some of the places where the money that she's getting for her campaign, which is a couple $100,000 or 145, I think was the last total that I saw. But a lot of those comes from the same addresses and from insurance agencies. And I think that basically insurance agents or people that are actually benefiting most from this are buying influence within the state, and it's been ongoing for a long time with a supermajority that's veto-proof.
And we should say your opponent is Republican Kim Kendall. She is a former FAA air traffic controller. She defeated Nick Primrose, who I think many thought was the favorite to win. He was sort of endorsed by Rick Scott, had used to work for him, and was supported by a lot of bigwig Republicans. She has, I think, just gobs more money than you do, right? You've got a few $1,000s, and she's got well over 150,000. So how do you fight that? How do you even try to compete in an arena where you have so much less funding?
Well, there's only so much competition you can do, I suppose. I mean, the underdogs have won in the past, and I may win again. I just think that being who I am, presenting myself, even in talk shows like this, thank you for the opportunity to get my word out. You just do what you can, and let the voters decide. And if the voters decide, a lot of times people just vote for party, et cetera. But when they actually look at the platforms and look at, who's running, hopefully there's more of that where I can get some votes and possibly win this thing.
And we should say we have invited your opponent to come on the program as part of our ongoing election coverage. We have not heard back from those requests, but she certainly is still welcome to come. Talk about Amendment 4. That's an issue that a lot of people are looking at in this, in November, whether or not to legalize recreational marijuana.
Well, I totally agree with legalizing marijuana. I mean, just for the pure fact of just having it's going to be purchased. You know what I mean? So now we could actually get tax dollars from it. We could actually help the state.
I'm sorry, Amendment 3. I apologize.
Yeah, I know what you
Amendment
meant.
4 is the
Amendment
abortion.
4 is abortion.
Yeah.
I know what you meant. I totally believe in the value of marijuana medically, simply because it can, I think, take away a lot of the dependence on a lot of controlled medications that are not necessarily as good, such as a lot of antidepressants and dealing with PTSD, dealing with pain. It has a lot of benefits that we are not taking advantage of simply because we're making it illegal for whatever reason.
But I mean, it is legal for medical uses.
Correct, but it needs to be expanded. So it's not even legal, for example, for pain, for chronic pain. It's not, unless you have some other underlying thing. You can't just get medical marijuana for chronic pain, which is one of the biggest benefits that it has, as an example. But about recreational use, I think that it would decrease a lot of the crime or criminal penalties and that we've seen in the state, and it's going to be smoked. Let's control it. Let's get the additives out of it. Let's get a pure system, and get the tax benefits as well. It hasn't had a bad benefit on or a bad effect on any of the states that have recreational laws right now.
St. Johns County is battling rapid growth. Some would say, that it's really behind the 8 ball on growth that's already permitted and that is being realized every day. It's obviously been an issue at the county level. What do you think at the state level you would do or could do on that front?
Infrastructure is a big thing. Unfortunately, you can't move to paradise and lock the door behind you. It's an old saying, but infrastructure, but also just making sure that there's affordable housing with the development that is coming, because a lot of times now, for the growth that has been approved and for the growth that's coming in, people can't afford to live and, say, work in the private sector or in the service sector, which is the economy's highly dependent on. So we need to make sure that we do have affordable housing in every area that we're doing. Also, just infrastructure, like I say, getting away from the, I'd like to see the county, if possible, get away from so much septic system near, causing so much runoff into the St. Johns River and into a lot of the tributaries. And, we need more sewer systems, basically.
I want to take a call from Eric in Arlington. Just briefly, Eric, go ahead.
Hey, real quick. First of all, thank you for doing what you're doing. It's obvious that in America, folks are just trying to curry favor with millionaires and billionaires and corporations, whether it be Joe Rogan or Donald Trump, who had a meeting in his office or at Mar-a-Lago where he promised oil companies lots of big tax breaks if they voted for him and helped him raise money. Whatever stopgap measures were in place that kept this from happening in the past are not there anymore. Can you if you could address that one? I appreciate it. Thank you.
And just briefly.
Yeah, I think a lot of that goes to the federal level. That's the Citizens United decisions that were made through the Supreme Court, which need to be overturned. I don't know that we can do much on the state level on that, except just be cognizant of it and actually make people aware and bring light to where the dirty money is.
Yeah. Well, Keith Matthews, he is running for the District 18 House seat. Thanks so much for being on the program.
Oh, thank you.
And early voting starts in St. Johns County and Duval County on October 21st. It starts in Clay County October 22nd and Nassau on October 23rd. So don't forget to vote. Coming up next, Jacksonville's best local weirdo on how to celebrate your inner aberrations.
And vote MatthewsRN.com.
Welcome back. Well, if you like entertainment that's on the edge or underground altogether, an upcoming Halloween themed event might be just the thing for you. I'm joined now by Cameron Kirkland, organizer of the upcoming Underground Freak Show and Oddities Fair at Intuition Aleworks. Hey, Cameron, welcome back.
Thank you.
I'm also joined by Johanna Maresco, the event's host.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very glad to meet you. So, Johanna, this year Folio Weekly crowned you Best Local Weirdo.
A true honor.
So that covers a lot of terrain. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do. I mean, you're a model, you're a musician.
Yes, I do all kinds of creative things. Primarily, I'm a musician. I am the electric violinist in a band called the Crew Shadows, and we've played a lot of shows, a lot of places. We actually have one coming up in Jacksonville, October 26th. I am a model. I like creating all kinds of interesting photos that kind of spark imagination when people look at them. I make some oddities art myself. I have a cosmetics line, and I put on all kinds of cool gothic and alternative events in Jacksonville, as well as participating in the Endless Night Vampire Ball, where I'm a host.
Okay. And so one of the kinds of modeling you do, I understand, is vampire modeling in dark fashion. Explain to
Yes.
people who may not know what that is, including me, what that is.
I like to find beauty in darker things. I think that there's a lot of beauty to be found in unexpected places, and I like bringing that out in themes that people don't usually think of it. I think it's more interesting, and I think people like seeing something different.
Can you give us an example of something that kind of illustrates what you're talking about?
Oh, I wish we had my photos. That would show it so much better.
Do you have an Instagram page?
I sure do. It's Johanna Maresco.
Okay.
Yeah.
So people could look up some of your
They
work?
sure could. Yeah.
Are they mostly photos of yourself? Are you a photographer or
Mostly photos of myself, and I usually make my outfits or I have them made for me. I like to create things from scratch, so it's something new for people to look at.
That's cool. Cameron, this is the Underground Jacksonville's inaugural event of this kind. So
Yes.
tell us, first of all, what we can expect. I mean, it's a freak show and oddities fair.
Yeah, so as you know, I run a bunch of pop-up markets, and I used to vend a lot of oddities and strange finds and strange home decor. And I wanted to figure out how to not just do a fair, but also make the event even more attractive with performances. And I've met Johanna through my markets. I've met her at her goth nights, and I didn't realize how burgeoning and growing the alternative scene is in Jacksonville. And there's so many amazing, weird, strange performers in Jacksonville and in Gainesville. And so we've recruited a number of talents for the show, like fire flow, alternative performances, some burlesque, for the freak show. And how it's going to be run is kind of like a talent show. So at the end of the night, we're going to crown the Underground Freak Show's biggest freak.
Yeah.
It's going to be a crowd vote. But we also have the Oddities Fair. We have 50 plus oddity vendors outside.
And I think of a freak show as something along the lines of like the Jim Rose Circus sideshow. Are these people like swallowing swords and eating glass and that kind of stuff? Or?
We do have one person doing fire flow. I don't have anyone swallowing swords. But to your point earlier, you were talking about gothic fashion. We have performers that are in super alternative makeup and dress, like goth drag queens. We also have two performers who have this really unique band, and they're both like a Dame Darcy and Kilo Christie. They do a really cool duet. It's super freaky, super fun. Yeah, so it's just prepare to be surprised. when
And
you come
is
to the
there
freak
like an
show.
age range that this is for, this event?
It's for anyone 18 and over.
Okay. And it's at
Yes.
Intuition.
It's at Intuition Beer Hall.
Yeah. All right. It's the Underground Freak Show and Oddities Fair. Johanna, I think it'll be a fun event. What's your plan as a host?
To delight and dazzle and help introduce people to these amazing performers and concepts that we have. Something like this, it's one thing to look it up on the internet or read about it, but nothing beats actually being there and seeing it in person and interacting with it in person. And my role is to help people engage with it more.
Yeah. All right. Well, Johanna Maresco, Cameron Kirkland, thanks so much for being here today. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
All right, up next, London Mauling. News for Jack sportscaster Alessandra Pomprian gives us the London lowdown.
Mayo Clinic, working to detect the undetectable by using AI technology to identify signals in the human voice that indicate heart disease. More at mayoclinic.org/Florida.
Clay Today, proudly serving Clay County, Florida. The Clay Today, Clay County Leader, Oakleaf, and Keystone Heights Herald. Your community newspapers. More information at claytodayonline.com.
On the next Fresh Air, actress and producer Riley Keough joins us to talk about the memoir she co-authored with her mother, Lisa Marie Presley, who, before her unexpected death, chronicled her childhood, her marriage to Michael Jackson, memories of her father, Elvis, and growing up in his shadow. Join us.
Today at noon on WJCT News 89.9.
The financial sector is looking at a new customer, the wrongfully convicted.
There are no other options for innocent people getting out of prison. There's no other funding available. There's no loans. So what are they to do?
They're turning to financial firms who provide exonerees with cash, but at interest rates so high, it's like a new kind of confinement. That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11, here on WJCT News 89.9.
More Americans than ever are choosing to vote by mail. Still, repeated baseless claims of voter fraud continue to cast a shadow over the process, at least for some. We look at the rule changes states have made since the last election and why more of us should trust voting by mail. That's next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. Well, it was another Sunday upset for Jacksonville's Jaguars, getting to be a regular thing. Sadly, they fell to the Chicago Bears 35-16, and we're joined as we are each week of the season by News for Jack sportscaster Alessandra Pomprian. Hey, Alessandra, how's it going?
Hi, well, listen, I'm fine. The Jaguars aren't. But you know what? I was just like, for their own sake, I was like, at least they don't have to get on a plane and fly all the way back across the world with that loss. Because that would just be the worst flight I think you would ever take, right? I mean, thinking about
Grim.
how bad, oh my God, so grim. But fortunately, they don't have to do that. They'll be in London this week. They have today off. And I think Doug Peterson lets them go roam around London. And then tomorrow they'll be back to start game prep for the Patriots, who are also not a good football team, but it's going to be a competitive football team because it's two bad football teams competing against each other. And the Jaguars may not even win that game. I mean, at this point, I've been so optimistic for them, but after the performance yesterday against the Bears, you can't be optimistic at this point. They absolutely, they did it to themselves. You can't drop passes. I mean, there was 4 would have been touchdown passes dropped. I mean, you can't do that. 2 from Gabe Davis, 1 from Christian Kirk, 1 from Brian Thomas Jr. There were overthrown passes. There were underthrown passes. The defense gave no effort, and it was evident when you saw them jogging during plays in the second half. And then on top of that, the flags. There was one Chicago drive that ended with a touchdown, and it was because the Jaguars gave them 3 first downs because of their flag. So frankly, it was pathetic.
I want to ask you, because after the game, head coach Peterson said that he liked that the team didn't give up and that they kept fighting. But in the locker room, safety Andre Sisco said that he thought that the defense quit.
Yeah. Yeah, very different views. Obviously, like you said in the press conference, Doug said that he liked their fight. But Andre Sisco told Action News Jax that, exactly what you said, that they gave up and they weren't showing the effort. I think he said, paraphrasing this, but he said that they the least that they can do is come with a 100% effort, and that his teammates basically wasn't doing that. And he said partly that was him too. That's really frustrating to hear as a Jaguars fan and just as someone covering the team, because you're like, you didn't even show up. I mean, we could see it, but you didn't even give your 100% effort. I mean, I get if you got blown up with coverage, and Caleb Williams is a very good quarterback. He had a career day yesterday, 4 touchdown passes, and this is only
He's a rookie, right?
Yeah, he's a rookie. This is his 6th game ever in the NFL.
Wow.
It's a good job for the Bears, but if you get you miss a tackle or something like that, whatever, next play. But if you just don't even bring effort, if I was a Jaguars fan, which of course I'm not, I cover them, but I would just be so infuriated and disappointed to hear that from the guys that you root for every single week. I think that is just ridiculous to say.
It's something that you've talked about on this program before, but for people who don't understand it, we're talking about the defensive strategy that they use is kind of man coverage. Explain why that's not been working for them.
Yeah, and so the way the defense does it is they switch in and out of players, in and out of, like, they'll show one defense, but then they'll actually move to a different defense. It's hard to explain in only a couple minutes, but basically, I think the biggest issue yesterday was that Caleb Williams did such a good job confusing them. There was one touchdown pass to Cole Kmet down the sideline. And you saw the Jaguars defense had no clue what was going on. He looked I think he looked left. Then he turned to the right and passed, but everyone was, at first going to the left because they were following him, but didn't realize you could tell that no one knew what was going on. They're moving around all the time. When you have defenses, if they're moving around too much, there's something going on. Someone is not communicating with each other, and it's just, they just got torn up.
Just a scramble. So they're next week at Wembley.
Yeah.
And they get a play day in London today, which hopefully boosts their spirit a little bit. But where do you think the team's head's at going into this next game?
I would be panicking. At this point, I'd be panicking. You're 1-5. There's no chance for you to, I don't think there's a chance for them to make the playoffs. But right now they're competing for the number 1 overall draft pick. And if you're competing for the number 1 overall draft pick, that means that you had the worst season in the NFL. And that's just, if I was the Jaguars, that is not something that's not where I want to be.
I mean, when does that become a strategy? To actually be deliberately losing so you get the first round draft pick?
Jaguars won't do that.
Okay.
No. I would be shocked if that was there. Now, some teams, you've seen it before, some teams may do that, but the Jaguars I do not think would do that. But if they play so poorly, that's just where they're going to end up. But I don't think they'll deliberately at all tank their season. I'd be shocked.
Well, we will circle back after the Patriots game next week. Alessandra Pombrian, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, hopefully it's better and more positive.
Hopefully. We'll see. That's our program. Thank you so much for listening. We encourage your feedback and suggestions. You can send either to First Coast Connect at WJCT.org. If you missed anything, catch our rebroadcast at 8 o'clock tonight, or you can find our entire archive on your favorite podcast platform. The executive producer of First Coast Connect is David Luckin, back in town after a little break. Our show is produced by Stacey Bennett and directed by Brady Coram. Jamie Valet is our associate producer. Our theme music is performed by Club de Belugas. Join us tomorrow when we explore why women are being required to turn over their cell phones and in some cases their food stamps at maternity centers around Florida. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
Wayne Hogan of the Terrell Hogan Personal Injury and Wrongful Death Law Firm. When people are hurt through no fault of their own, answering who, what, when, where, why, and how is critical to proving the truth. More at terrellhogan.com.
AEG presents Americana bluegrass guitarist and songwriter Robert Earl Keen at the Florida Theater on Wednesday, December 4th. Robert Earl Keen, The Lights, Camera, Christmas Tour. More info at floridatheater.com.
This is WJCT